Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. And now to our show. My son Dave and his wife came up from Baltimore to spend Christmas week with us. And we took a moment, Dave and I, to record another episode of the Practice Podcast with a further focus on the deeply internal nature of social inaction and how it connects to practice, particularly the practice of conversation. So this recording was done with an external recorder, not on Zoom, as have most of the others. So the sound will be a little different, but the content, the weaving of thought that particularly Dave does in this episode is well worth perking up the listening ears for this new episode. And Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to a new conversation with Dave and Dad. Social inaction is our question. Practice is our answer. No, it isn't. Practice is definitely woven into our concern and interest in social inaction. And so over the last 18 podcasts, Dave, over the 200 and nearly 50 that we've done, we've been pursuing the question. And if we get closer to an answer today, it'll be because you've done some more homework. And what have you been studying in that homework that you're bringing to us today?
Today we'll start out with this question, which is captured by this excerpt from I Heart Huckabees with Lily Tallman and Jason Swartz having a little conversation.
Have you ever transcended space and time?
Yes. No. Time, not space. No, I don't know what you're talking about.
And that's what we're going to talk about.
Because I've had one more little episode for our discussion of George Herbert Mead, the pragmatist philosopher who did most of his writing during the early 20th century. And this was, I would say he had one of his themes, in addition to the nature of the act and social interaction and social group life, was some explorations of what is the nature of time, and had a whole philosophy of time that he was developing. I would say through a little bit in his early years, but towards his latter years in the late 20s, and then right before he died in I believe 1931, he was doing lectures and had some essays and some incomplete articles that were found, some of them developed posthumously as a book called The Philosophy of the Present. And I think it's another interesting link between what we've been talking about with the inaction perspective overall, which is a way of looking at what we've been calling practice embedded in real interaction with the world and with other people in particular.
That's right.
But there's a couple of neat ways of connecting this even to modern physics. A book that I picked up a while ago, recommended on one of the several YouTubes and podcasts that I've been listening to, a book by Carlo Rovelli, who's a physicist in Italy. He wrote a number of books, one of which was a nice book called The Order of Time, in which he looks at the nature of time and space, and comes up with some interesting ideas, which oddly enough connect fairly well with what George Herbert Mead was working on. And at that time, Einstein had already completed his initial seminal papers on time and relativity, and so that was a big discussion in the by the late 1920s, as was the early models of quantum physics.
A lot happening, right?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting time, in particular, where the old Newtonian ideas of space and time and energy really were under question, and so Mead approached it. Largely, he approached it as kind of a question of philosophy and the nature of empiricism. When you have these major scientific paradigm shifts, where people are trying to kind of hold what seems like almost irrational or notions about time and space that just aren't at all like a rational experience of everyday time and objects, and especially when you get into quantum indeterminacy and then relativity of time that Einstein was coming up with. And so what does this say about kind of the philosophy of science? But he also kind of ventured a little bit into what maybe time and space may be as experience, but also maybe a bit beyond that, into what might be the nature of time and space. And in that discussion, he was working with a contemporary of his, a little bit younger, the philosopher. I'll make sure I have his full name right. Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh yeah.
Who I'm mentioning partly because the people in doing this enaction kind of emergent complexity research are very much into Alfred North Whitehead, because he wrote a couple of very important works on what's called, I guess we could call it a process philosophy, process-based philosophy that's very compatible with what we've been saying about enaction and those dynamics and evolution and what people are doing with contemporary cognitive psychology and neuroscience that we talked about with the brain, predictive processing of the brain, the free energy principle of entropy. All of that was found to be fairly compatible with Whitehead. But as Whitehead was also working with some of these emerging ideas of trying to figure out relativity and quantum theory and what all that means, he tended to settle on, I might be getting this wrong, I won't say too much about it, but he was sort of leaning towards a notion of time, for example, that was maybe had a more permanence, that he kind of wanted to keep hold of the idea of a fundamental time and maybe even something fundamental underlying objects and their permanency, that Mead was starting to critique. He had some interesting critiques of that, which I won't go too much into that because I'm not sure I understand Whitehead's positions all that well. But it's just interesting that in the type of critiques Mead was developing right up to the time of his death, though the direction of those critiques hold up very well with current models of physics, especially this Rovelli's approach.
Wow. I got to tell you two things quickly. Peter wrote a paper called Process Wisdom for a New Age sometime back in the 70s or early 80s. And he had been studying Whitehead.
Oh, yeah.
So our interest in practice and social action was somewhat predicated on Peter's understanding of the importance of process. So it puts us right back into the time-space question. So that's cool. Very
yeah,
cool.
And I think those who really get into Whitehead, he's one of these philosophers who likes to kind of come up with his own terms, and it really takes a lot of deep study to even understand what he's talking about. Whereas Mead's writing is you have to kind of get through that. The philosopher's language, and especially in this Philosophy of the Present book, it's not quite as coherently written. But his ideas are, as I've been trying to convey them, are relatively easy to grasp. So I think we can kind of have a new context that might help us.
Teach your old man some new tricks.
So part of what we're discussing will depend on picking up our prior couple of episodes on Mead and social interaction, and especially our discussion of the philosophy of the act, because the experience of time, our sense of present, of past, and of future are very much tied into the nature of acts and the construction of acts as an ongoing process that really makes the background of reality into something that's meaningful, has things in it, objects. We act towards things, and then with humans, with the social interaction, is entire extra layers of abstraction that gives us kind of the conversing symbolic sense of time and space and objects and self and other. And so one of the things that implies for time is what is the present? What is it? What is this sense of now? Does the sense of now rely on the existence of a clock? Everyone having the same clock, everyone having the same time, or so that we're able to sync our actions because the two of us interacting have the same fixed referral that's out there.
Yeah.
That is actually kind of governing our course of action in that sense. And Mead doesn't think this so much is necessary. He talks about the present being specious present. Specious in that if we think about what is our experience right now, it's kind of doubtful. It's kind of, isn't even there. So we've been binge watching the Rockford Files this week. This is right before New Year's where we're have some time to binge watch a few things. And the classic 70s show, The Rockford Files, always ends with that freeze frame with James Garner with a bemused expression.
That's right. Oh no, it's
after
happened to me again.
Little hook at the end where he thought he was making money as a detective, and then it's pulled out from under him. So, but if you think of that, if there really were a freeze frame, what would there really be an experience? Would there be anything there without that ongoing motion? So
that's a real good question.
Yeah. So really, any moment of now is kind of an illusion in a way. It's kind of that. If you could stop time, you'd get this set of relationships between the molecules that you're interacting with and that are going on in your brain. But there's still this need of processing and ongoing processing time, even within the brain. Things take time, but more than that, they're ordered in a very particular way. And we had talked in the past about the older notion of like the stimulus and response models of behaviorism that Mead was arguing against.
Yeah.
Where that had a much more of a mechanistic model that would fit with the older kind of Newtonian notions of time, where the outside world is presenting the conditions and triggering things in the brain. You're connecting your memories and spitting out a behavior. But the whole thing about Mead's definition of the act was one where something's being built up, and
from the inside out.
Yeah, from the inside out, with a heavy emphasis on prediction. So which is again compatible with current kind of an action-based notions of neuroscience and action, where what we're largely doing is building up through our learning a world in which we can, as accurately as possible, predict what's going to happen next. So there's nothing in the real future there that's informing us, but we're trying very hard to predict a future based on what is at least real from our past and has kind of laid down that foundation that we can use again. But it's really in the act that you have this construction of time and space.
Huh. And that's instantaneous. I mean, if we're talking time.
Well, it's
You're building up, but whenever you pay attention to that, is that
that
awareness of the act, or?
yeah, it's the accomplishment of the moment. But if you some of the better neurophysiology instruments are starting to record how long does that actually take, and it does take some milliseconds.
Yeah.
You never quite, we can kind of tell how fast it is. If there's a ball coming towards your head, we can duck if you see it. So it's at least somewhere around that timing. But then if you look at brain scans, you'll see these patterns of firing that kind of start from a small area and spread out, and then collapse back again into other areas. So there's and that happens within a second. But there's still this clear kind of visual sense of processing that has to go on. And so if we quickly kind of go over what Mead's philosophy of act consisted of, you can kind of see the components for this. So he has, if you think of it's kind of a layered thing where we're kind of we're doing a number of our actions that are kind of in the background, like you're driving a car and you're not paying attention to everything in the scene, but your muscles are kind of doing their own, your muscles in perception are doing kind of their own less organized layer of prediction to keep you on the road. And those are sort of like mini acts, but the more the conscious act are the ones where you have an impulse, and it's usually an emotion-based one, where usually specifically where the prediction has gone wrong.
Yeah, like a car slowing fast in front of you, things like that.
Yeah, and you have to then quickly reorganize the expectations and come up with what is the thing in the environment that now matters. And in doing so, this is going from the impulse stage to the perception stage. But Mead has tied in with perception an ongoing kind of manipulation stage. Manipulation is where you're kind of doing something with the world, doing something about that impulse. So if it were, if someone were about to hit you with a bag or something, and you had to push it aside before it hits you with your hand, there's a sequence of perceiving where the thing is, having your muscles anticipate where it's going to be in the future, and then gradually that modeling of the distant of the experience that's both distant in time and space, then luckily will, if you're good, will connect so that you can brush aside the thing that's about to hit you, and then if you succeed, that's kind of the consummation phase where you can then evaluate, and maybe that becomes the impulse for further actions. Like, why'd you try to hit me with your handbag? But he really kind of gets into what does that imply for the nature of time, or what's kind of the real experience of temporality on that basis. And part of that is that act then is starting to pull out its own relevance, what it is, what it is that's relevant in that moment in the scene, and from the background of light and shapes and things, you get something that's these emergent objects that have meaning. And Mead defines meaning again as the tendency to act, or the tendencies of what could happen next. So the meaning of objects are very much this predictive basis based on learning in the past.
So you'd have to identify that thing coming at you as either a handbag or something that you don't know it's a handbag. You think it's a stick, or
Yeah, whatever it is at first, it's kind of a blur of motion,
Yeah.
and then the rest of your brain starts to put together its components as it gets closer. But then it's really as it may even be after you deflected it that it kind of congeals into what we would call, hey, that's a handbag. What's
Yeah.
that being swung at me for?
Yeah, and you're already in that same instance wondering why the bag's being slugged, why you're being slugged in the first place.
Well, that might come later. That might come
Okay.
afterwards.
I mean, right now it's just
Yeah.
save yourself from getting slugged by.
So
the
you have
handbag.
this kind of semi first level thinking where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, this, almost the reflex level, but it's
Yeah.
still this dynamics of the act. And then at that point, after that, then you can do this abstraction that, especially that humans are able to do well. And Mead actually does refer to this, taking the role of the other as essential to that project. And it's kind of an interesting way of thinking of it is that perhaps in the evolution of that skill, we first had to learn to take the role of social others, put ourselves in the place of what some social other would be doing with that object, and even perhaps getting more towards that symbolic representation of what those meaningful objects are, to help then coordinate the rest of our brain at more of this reflex level of organizing time and space. I'll kind of come back to that later, but
It's interesting.
yeah, but he really, and this is certainly unique for his time, and still you don't see a lot in cognition, is that this part of building up the space-time of events includes this imaginative putting yourself in the place of both social others and not simply the mechanics of physics.
Right.
And that actually gets embedded into how we do interact with non-living objects. So there's this little bit of a social, even in mundane acts that don't necessarily involve other people or animals. So this is so where does this idea of the specious present come in? He uses some interesting distinctions between the emergence of objects in space within the act as kind of moving from a sense of spaceless time into timeless space. And this is kind of a sense of the emergence of a meaningful object within the act into experience. So the idea of spaceless time is that in our kind of the background experience, let's say we're moving towards sitting down in a chair. You are moving, you have sort of an initial act-based goal to sit in the chair, but much of that is going to be in the background where your actual brain is processing the changing picture of the chair itself. So as you're moving towards it, the actual, photons and shadows and things bouncing off the chair are giving your brain and a sequence of changes. The angle of the angles change, the color and shadows change, and your brain if your brain weren't able to tie it together, it would just be this blurry mess.
Which you're not likely to sit on a
Yeah,
blurry mess.
and it's in the and next to it are other colors and changes and shifting things within the room.
Mm-hmm.
All of that has to be systematically ignored while you're making something special about all the changes that are then given this object meaning as the chair in which I will sit. Now, as you're approaching the chair, this is occurring over time. So something is stitching together this time kind of vague duration of shifting events into what is sustained as a shape and an object, the chairness. So in Mead says in this sense, we're abstracting from a time-based blurring of events, a timeless, or a time, something that's somewhat distinct from time, being the chair. This is the same chair I saw on one side of the room. It will be the same chair that I sit in once I get to it.
Mm.
And all of that being, and so that's the sense of shifting from a shapeless background into a timeless space where objects are concerned. And this is and so as we experience the present, a lot of it is this confirmation of expectations, where we can mostly focus on what's relevant to an action, ignoring everything else, and it gives us a sense of permanent things, or a little bit more permanence of things outside of their changing nature in time. And if you really think about how is their nature changing, if you get right down to it, it's just clouds of atoms and molecules that happen to be consistently staying together. Mostly, at that level, we can certainly ignore things. It becomes a blurred background. But we do also want to be ready for contingency. So as we're sitting in the chair, we sit down, we feel something small and hard underneath of us. It's like, there's impulse. What is that? And as you explore a little bit more with a new act, you find, that was my glasses.
Oh, no.
But they didn't become glasses. They didn't come extruded into space until you kind of started turning that into a new act. So it's just a kind of a interesting way of thinking of time and space in that psychology way. Maybe that doesn't seem all that profound in a sense, but it is at least reminding us that even time and space are constructs as we experience them, and to a large degree social constructs. Ones where something like, what are glasses? What are they? They can be seamlessly integrated into the acts, which Mead said wouldn't necessarily involve thinking. So thinking occurs. Sitting in the chair doesn't necessarily involve much thinking once you've kind of prepared and you know that the chair is still going to be there when you land. But the thinking about what? About the
glasses.
Figuring out what this thing is occurs when you sit on it.
Right.
And then from there, it's easy for our ability to have symbolic conceptions about it. Seamlessly be interacting with those experiences and figuring out, are those my glasses? Whose glasses?
Well, I was going to say it starts a whole other social issue if they're not your glasses. If you find out that they're your wife's glasses.
So
now I have to ask though, and maybe you're coming to it, and that is, I get the time, but place I don't quite get yet. Other than, is that the location of the chair and all that, but what is place?
Well, place would be just within the same. Well, probably in our experience of the present, we experience place and location. It may seem to have more relevance than time at that moment. So
Yeah.
then we're kind of, as we're focusing on objects, we're focusing on where they are in space.
Okay, I get it.
But it's that extension of the object over time, in which time is kind of faded into, a little bit into the background until it becomes an object. So we expect, if we see a car coming, we expect that we kind of start to calculate without our realizing it how fast the car ought to be coming towards us. But then maybe it slows down in a way, so we would then, at that point, in addition to the location of the car in space and its change in space coming towards us, we then start making an object of time or duration, and maybe start thinking,
so I get 80,
discussing it.
an
Hey,
eighth of a second.
what's he slowing down for? That
Yeah,
kind
what's
of
up ahead? Yeah.
yeah, what's in the road? He just stopped suddenly. That was an impulse around duration that we then have to figure out. And
Right.
in that sense, time becomes just another symbolic object.
Yeah. I get it now. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You said psychology is where Mead was coming from. What are there other dimensions like physics that could explain?
Yeah, that's where I think we are at a good point of jumping into that, because Mead was working through these ideas, but then when you have something like Einstein's models of relativity, relativity presented some, initially to scientists, something that didn't seem at all like it fit our everyday experience of time.
No.
And I think what Mead realized is that what he may have found interesting is that it didn't need to fit that experience of time. So if you really look at one of the cool things, in this Ravelli book goes into that, about what Einstein found with relativity, that time, actual time, how long something takes, is completely dependent on its motion and I'm probably getting this wrong. Its motion, its position in relation to sources of mass or gravity, in particular, so that the planet, which is a big mass of gravity, actually curves time.
Yeah.
This is the notion of space-time, how you have to have the two together, and they're defined by their relationship of what's locally the amount of mass in relation to energy, or something like that. So the main sense is that time is very much a local phenomenon, meaning that literally, as we stand up, time, I hope I'm getting this right, time is faster for our head than it is for our feet.
Yeah.
I think it's faster. It might be slower. I'm not getting that wrong, but in any case, it's different. And there are actually now clocks that are sensitive enough to tell the difference between the head and the feet, or elevation in time, because the closer you are to the mass center of Earth, time goes. Boy, I'm thinking it goes slower. So one interesting thing was when they were building GPS satellites.
Yeah.
The engineers had to argue with their managers, because the managers were saying, why are we spending money to put clocks into these things? And they had to explain, well, because Einstein shows that the satellites' clocks are going to be different than the clocks on the surface, and you have to make those calculations.
Yeah.
And it's not like the clocks get
Otherwise,
off.
we'd all be off. by
Yeah,
about
it's
a
literally
foot.
time is different. Time itself. So clocks out in space are running at a different speed. It's not because they're broken. because time itself is different.
I
So
never knew that. It
yeah.
makes sense.
So Mead was these ideas were coming out in the late 20s and 30s, and Mead was dealing with them. One way he approached them was to say, well, does the reality of this matter to our understanding of action? And he kind of treated it initially as, well, in a way it's perspectives. So the only way for this to matter is that it matters within conversations.
Yeah.
Because it's so abstract, it really is only something you can talk about.
Yeah.
But what is it that we experience? Well, we don't experience the time differences between our head and our feet, as far as we know, unless that's why we lay down when we sleep, so that everything can sort itself out. But what's interesting is how all of that is so blurred and abstracted. And one of the ways that Carlo Rovelli approached time, the nature of time, was kind of along these lines, to really take into account that there is no universal time. There's no universal time in the neighborhood. God does not have a clock. Everywhere in the universe, time is local, and he even, I'll talk a little bit about how maybe there's something there at the subquantum level. Time itself may not even be there in a real sense. There's something else going on.
But
So
we need time as social beings. We need as thinking human. We need time.
yeah, humans have time.
So we
animals have time.
in a sense invent it then, or inherit the idea.
Well, we have to accommodate. We have to accommodate something that that luckily we don't have to worry about, because it does emerge at the macro level as soon as you have atoms.
Right.
As soon as there are atoms in interaction, there's at least something that could be called time. But one interesting aspect that does kind of connect to what we've been talking about with an action theory is how thermodynamics at this macro level are very essential to the emergence of time. We've been talking about thermodynamics in terms of entropy,
Right.
and that living systems have to export entropy in order to stay alive. What they're basically doing is taking things that are in a low entropy state, which means they have a more unified distribution of energy or other configurations that can be used to do work. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, entropy goes from higher to lower. And lower entropy is kind of this chaos diffusion in which there isn't an ability to work. So animals eat food because the food for them is in a higher entropy state. The molecular bonds of glucose, when broken apart, release energy that can be used to keep a biological system going. And then they export, but they can't keep the refuse of those sugars in them. They have to excrete some of it.
Right.
And so that is in a broad way exporting entropy, so it doesn't accumulate within the system and disrupt it until such times as those disruptions can't be sustained in the animal, and the systems that sustain the animal break apart and the animal dies.
Yeah.
This accounts for any living system. We talked about it before as the measure of entropy being what Carl Friston calls a free energy distribution, which could also be framed in terms of information, but I don't have to deal with that now.
Yeah.
Take this further. What is then a rock? How does a rock exist? Or let's say a pile of wood. A pile of wood isn't in itself living anymore, but its carbon bonds are very persistent and strong. But they are in somewhat of a lower entropy state in relation to fire, but you set fire to the wood, and that interaction releases the carbon bonds of the wood pile, and then you have something that's gone to a high entropy state, because one thing about that is it's irreversible. Any move from low to high entropy is irreversible. The wood cannot, the burnt wood cannot be returned to the logs.
No.
Even in an infinite universe of random interaction, nothing will put those molecules back into the log, the set of logs it came from, because that's fundamentally impossible, and that's very important.
Yeah.
That this movement of low to high entropy always gives a certain order and always gives an irreversible arrow of time. And that arrow of time is actually one that, the physical universe itself relies upon, in a sense.
Yeah.
Why galaxies form the way they do, why planets coalesce out of the dust and stay stable until something big hits them, like the sun exploding, and why, and then how living systems have developed a further way of taking that kind of stability and adding a layer of complexity to it, by which they could export entropy and create their own kind of internal past and way of handling the past in predicting the future. The past, initially, for any living system, is its own physical structure that holds together in such a way that it continues to live.
The past?
The past, in a sense, you could think of a living system, very simple one, let's say a virus.
Yeah.
The fact that it still holds together as a virus means that it has a structure of relationships that have a past.
Ah.
But there's nothing in the real future that interacts with that present. But living systems quickly found that there's an advantage, or part of the essential part of living systems is that they predict the future, in a sense. They have in their essential organization a way of in a way modeling. That's not the best term, especially at these lower levels, but the fact that in order to continue, and they're able to do things with low entropy, they are able to create their own future in a way that anticipates it, in a way. And as nervous systems develop, this anticipation becomes much more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And then the social dimension adds even more sophistication, another level of emergence. And as we talked before, the human conversation adds yet another level of emergence, and add that to social culture and things like that. And what you have is layer upon layer of very complex self-referential self-organization, each of which is a solution to this thermodynamic problem of dissipating entropy, but one in which solving the problem gives a more and more ability to predict the future, make use of the past, and do so in a way that gives us a sense of the species present, as Mead has discussed.
Wow.
So what Ravelli talks about that, and I think that also we had talked. We could connect this to what we discussed before about Markov blankets and statistical and probability dynamics and all that, but we don't need to get into that. One interesting other aspect, though, that Ravelli gets into is what's happening at the quantum level. So we've once you have electrons emerging and atoms and macro, anything that then becomes connected into macro phenomena, the ones that we can actually measure, then we're talking about these dynamics of thermodynamics, and that time then is something that, in a sense, the blurring of all those micro dynamics in which time is really the expression of this relatedness at any point at which you look. But when you get below the atom into these quantum mechanics, even back in Mead's time, the quantum theorists were wondering, it would seem that there is a more fundamental indeterminacy in which time, even time, the time in Einstein's relativity sense didn't quite make sense. It wasn't clear that there is time below this quantum level in the same way that we think. But Ravelli is among the physicists who are at least making that connection to thermodynamics and then what goes on beneath quantum in a way that seems to be fundamentally related. He doesn't go into, I don't think physicists have all the answers to this. It has to do with, he works a lot on quantum gravity, and he didn't go too much into it in this book, but that's mixed in there somewhere and has to do with time and some other fundamental forces. What we experience at the point of measuring, I'll just say one idea that I think I understand what he's trying to say. When things become, one of the issues with quantum physics is that seems to be this cloud of it, like when an electron emerges, there seems to be a cloud of indeterminacy of where the thing will be in space and how fast it's going. And in the fundamental way, you can measure, as soon as you measure where a thing is and how fast it's going, it's collapsed into this one space. But until that point of measurement, it seems as though it could be anywhere within its quantum field. And so you get the sense of a thing being both like a particle and a wave, in which the wave is more like a cloud of indeterminacy and the particle is what collapses. But how does it collapse? And there's lots of theories about, we need a universal observer like God's mind, or we need a multiverse in order to explain this. And Ravelli at least doesn't resort to there being a multiverse. And he doesn't explain all of it, but I think what I like is that there is something in this collapsing moment that connects to thermodynamics in a way that I think what he's trying to say is basically it's this external macro scale interaction that matters for what happens at this quantum level. So that's the fact of this macro domain of time in interaction is what matters for how this more timeless, spaceless realm of the subatomic actually coalesces into something real. And it's kind of hard to express that, but I kind of like the idea. It's not. I guess one more context, without extending too far, is I talked in several episodes back. I forgot the number about David Bohm and his theory of quantum mechanics, which I still like. It's called pilot wave theory. He kind of has this sense of an electron emerging from a probability wave or probability domain, in which that probability domain isn't like all possible universes, but it's something there that needs what was often called a hidden variable in order to collapse into something that's real and solid, like an electron. Mm-hmm. And I like the idea that what Ravelli is talking about, this macro scale thing, is actually what is the interaction that's creating this variable that is collapsing what Bohm calls this hidden probability field into the single thing. But what's interesting about Bohm is that what's behind this timeless space is actually a unity, a holographic single nature in which in which it's almost like there's another scene in this I Heart Huckabees movie that I started the episode with, where Dustin Hoffman has this blanket, and it's a single blanket, and everything is within the blanket. But you have to realize that there's a singular holographic nature to everything, but it's this interaction with the particulars that create particulars in our experience of space and time. But what Ravelli says is that we live in just a corner of that universe, and maybe there's other aspects of the universe that don't have time and don't have space.
Yeah.
And that's where in those earlier podcasts I took off into some interesting esoterics, which I'll close with.
Okay.
Because if it'd be fun to speculate, then what would it be like for very advanced civilizations to fool around with space and time in the way we described it? Now, I like to think, for reasons I won't get into, that it's impossible. That time travel is impossible. And Ravelli, interestingly, doesn't make a statement about this, but I think that for him, it's very clear that there's no future that
We can get to and come back from.
Exactly. Now, in Einstein's theory, if you were in a fast spaceship, you were actually moving slower than people on the ground. So in a way, if you're moving faster, you're going through time faster than people on the ground, and yet at no time are you going ahead of people on the ground to be able to come back and say, "Hey, everyone, go and buy Apple stock because it's going to go up." That's impossible. So given that, you could still, though, have a very advanced civilizations who maybe get to that singularity point where they built these quantum computers, and the quantum computers are such that they can basically upload their brains into them and exist in this computational simulated world. At that point, they could be maybe very close to this threshold of time and timelessness, and make more of that. But then they'd have these immense problems of trying to figure out who's going faster and who's going slower. Like you can live faster, but then maybe you're coming up with a community that's going slower. And so it becomes very complicated. And in other podcasts, I talked about how that have to be like prediction engines built into the very fabric of space to make that work. But maybe there's even yet another layer, this sub-quantum layer, where there isn't really time, but there are these complex relations of dimension. Can mind exist there? Does mind exist there? Is there life? And is there something in this fundamental ordering, which isn't quite fixed space-time, and yet becomes a place where perhaps other sorts of minds can live? And then when you start hearing about other dimensions and things of that sort, then you start to wonder. And of course, my big question is, where is it that we live? Where is it that we live after we die?
Well, that could be another whole podcast episode. But I want to point out that one of the dimensions of this episode is how you're thinking and using the material that's available that you can look at, and in a moment, in an instant, make me understand what you said and anticipate what you might say next. So while we're going through this, is in a conversation, I'm thinking, listening, trying to make pictures in my head of what you're saying, particularly that part about sub-quantum being there, time travel, but it's instantaneous. I hear a word and I felt myself working with it, using it. I don't know what that is, but I felt it.
Yeah, maybe it would be quite a Zen mind to be able to experience that, taking yourself outside of that flow of time while you're still doing it. But maybe something.
Well, I can't claim that, but I can tell you that there's a thing that we call active listening that's been published a lot and taught. People think, well, I can teach active listening. But I think there's a whole different way of looking at active listening. That it's not listening, it's just presence in a way, and awareness of time and space, and other, all happening. But with you explaining it and parsing it out, that maybe in my head I was starting to pull a few things apart and saying, oh, this is what I'm doing right now, and this is who I am, and this is a table, all of that. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What's the payoff statement that we can end this conversation
Well,
with?
I suppose we should come back to practice.
Yeah.
Because that's what this podcast is supposed to be about. So
it is the practice podcast.
Yeah, so I think this is a good way of, again, framing what is practice as the unspoken, as the thing that's been learned, but that takes this, that manifests in action, and is usually something that's more like it occurs in a flow where we don't have to think about it too much. We don't have to discuss it too much. It just is there, ready to go. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it has its own time and space. But then to actually turn it into something that's interactive, like a learning where you have to teach someone else to practice.
Yeah.
It's almost like slogging through time. You have to go back from the flow into the real time in which you're slogging through and giving words to everything and trying to turn it back into something which in itself is more like it's flowing in its own time and space when you're actually doing it. So
Wow. Very good, indeed.
all right. Well, I'll leave with the scene from Dustin, where Dustin Hoffman explains time and space.
Okay, let's get started.
This is from I Heart Huckabees from 2004.
It's part of my investigation.
Yes, say this blanket represents all the matter and energy in the universe, okay? You, me, everything. Nothing's been left out, right? All the particles, everything.
What's outside this blanket?
More blankets, that's the point.
Blanket's everything.
Exactly, this is everything, okay? Let's just say that this is me, right? And I'm 60-odd years old, I'm wearing a gray suit, blah, blah, blah. And let's say over here, this is you, and you're 21, we got dark hair, etc. And over here, this is Vivian, my wife and colleague. And then over here, this is the Eiffel Tower, right? It's Paris. And this is a war. And this is a museum. And this is a disease. And this is an orgasm. And this is a hammer.
Everything is the same, even if it's different.
Exactly. But our everyday mind forgets this. We think everything is separate, limited. I'm over here, you're over there, which is true. But it's not the whole truth. Because we're all connected. Because we are connected.
Sure. Yeah.
All right, now.
Oh my Lord. Well, this has been very enlightening and fun. And I'm looking forward to more of your thoughts. Thank you for listening to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Podomatic, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again. Our webpage at inactionresearch.info.